platforms. Thank you for your support as always during the week. Like I said last week, somebody told me to do the whole if you like the podcast, rate us on Spotify and all that. So I've said it. Thank you very much to John Lyons for coming on last week. I really enjoyed his book. His book is go and check it out actually. Joy and Fear, the Beatles, Chicago in the 1960s. I also talked to John about history in general, British and American history and stuff like that. It was really interesting chat. So check that out from last week. This week, I'm going to get the introduction right. We've had a bit of a chat about it. So I'm going to introduce John as the head of the teaching of learning in UCD. John O'Connor, how are you doing?
Good afternoon, Derek. I'm delighted to be here to speak to you today. Yeah, head of teaching and learning in one particular school. We have many schools in UCD, so my workload is the School of Biomolecular and Biomedical Science. So that's where I'm based.
Biomolecular. That was a word. Sometimes you get these kind of blanks on words, and I was looking at it. I was reading the introduction for you beforehand, and I was kept stumbling over a word. I don't know what it is. It's like, I'm not going to say the word, John, because I can't say the word to be honest. But you know those big spiders, the kind of hairy spiders that begin with T.
The tarantulas.
Can't say the word. It's just stuck on it. I think everybody might have one of those words. But that for me was good. So when I had an expert in arachnids on, that was an interesting one. I had to kind of skirt around that one. But so John, we always start at the beginning. Could you give us a short history of your upbringing, please?
Well, I guess I don't know how unusual I am, but my life started at Lighthouses, and I was born actually in Northern Ireland, not because the Lighthouse service in Ireland is actually run by boat. It's one of the joint Island of Ireland operations where the Commissions of Irish Lights they oversee all of Northern Ireland and the Republic, so that's quite interesting. So I was born up in the north, but quickly moved to the Cork, to a place called Powerhead. It's near Whitegate, and it was very unusual because it wasn't an actual lighthouse. It was a fog signal. Only a fog signal was based there, and I think it shut down in 1970, I think it was. So it was the only place that ever had just a fog signal where families lived.
Okay.
For about 6 years, and then I moved to Ballycotton. And of course, the lighthouse is offshore there, so the family lives on their own on the land beside it. The houses were paid for by the Irish Lights. That was a year. Then we moved to Wicklow Head. Again, that's the lighthouse is there with the family, so you're with your father there. Stayed there for about 3 years. Then we went to the Bailey in Howth in Dublin, and was in one of those lovely two houses that you can see just on the peninsula. If you look over at the Bailey, you'll see those two houses on their own. And I lived in the one on the left there, so for 3 or 4 years. So that was really beautiful up there. And then we bought a house down in the village there, so lived there for the rest. So got to move around quite a bit until I was in secondary school, I can tell you. But beautiful, and grew up then in Dublin, and really school was grand. I mean, you don't really know what you're going to do in life. I don't think in early secondary school, do you?
No.
You kind of have to find out what subjects you like, and adapt a little bit to the teachers and the whole discipline. And we were a Christian Brothers school, obviously, in those days in the 80s, and I think corporal punishment went out the year I left school, so that was quite a historical moment. So I remember that actually, that nobody could be hit anymore after I left school. So that was good. But generally speaking, my upbringing was different. It was a lot of moving around, and but I think your personality develops to that. And again, maybe it makes people different. It was the largest family. There was 7 children in the family at that time, or 8. Lost a brother. But overall, a large family gels, and we got on very well. So we did great, and none of us have ever fallen out, which I think
historic.
Is fantastic. But from that point of view, science was always on my mind as I was growing up. I was always inquisitive. And I probably wouldn't have been more the arts or language direction. I knew I would go more the mathematical, biological, probably very early on. And certainly in secondary school, that was more than obvious, because I would have preferred those subjects, chemistry, maths, biology, rather than business, language. And I think most students could get some are good at everything, but most get an idea where they're landing in those particular areas by the end of school. So I knew the school wanted everyone to go on to third level, but my family hadn't a history of that. So, you needed grants. There wouldn't have been a lot of money, and it was important that I would be able to apply for a grant. So going to college was determined on whether or not I got a grant. And I do remember the year I went to college, Garrett Fitzgerald got into government, and he raised the bar on what you could earn in your family to get a grant in Ireland quite significantly. And it was that year I was going to college. So Garrett Fitzgerald is responsible for me probably going to university, because he raised a grant that year. I think it was 1980 or 81. And it's interesting how you remember things like that. It really is. So I went to Trinity. And I did science, science is good because you don't have to pick what you want to do too early in your degree.
Right.
In fact, in those days, Trinity allowed you to pick right from physics, maths, chemistry, and biology, and you didn't have to make up your mind for the first year. So you really could go in with an open mind. Most students know that they want to do either the mathematical physics end or the biology end, but there are a few who get a chance to take their time. In fact, I think Trinity and UCD still offer that kind of choice now, where you still can pick your choice later after a year. And I think that's really helpful for a 17 or an 18-year-old who really hasn't developed, matured. Certainly boys, the school I went to, I couldn't say we were all mature when we went to college. So I do think you have to be careful even when you pick your choice as a 17, 18-year-old. So obviously I picked the biology side, and I did a subject called physiology. So a lot of people wouldn't know what that is, but it's a very important subject in medicine, for example. It's really the workings of the body, and I really enjoyed that, and did well, and decided to go on and do a higher degree. But I obviously, like most students, I didn't know. I still had a lot of choices to make in college, and I think this is a real problem for a lot of students. They don't know what they want to do, and I was I going to do the HDIP for secondary school teaching, and I got offered that. Was I going to go on and do a laboratory type job? I got offered something there. But then when one of the professors in the university offered me a PhD, I kind of got pulled in and decided that that's something I would like, because it's a lot of commitment, not a lot of money, but it was something I decided I'd do, and I did. And 3.5 years later, I succeeded and went on from there working. So I kind of fell into a few things in my career, Derek, but mostly it was because I was interested in science, biology, and neuroscience was only developing as a subject then. There wasn't any degrees really in the world. So you had pharmacology, and you had biochemistry, and you had microbiology, but you didn't have neuroscience in those days, and it developed very quickly after the 80s. So it was something I got into myself. I knew that was what I was interested in. So that's kind of a very short introduction to my early years.
It's very very well told, and I just want to ask just a question about the Lighthouse, really, because it's not a usual upbringing, I guess. And there was a program on there. I don't know, maybe it was during lockdown, but it was about the Lighthouses of Ireland, and it got.
Well, I'm on it.
Oh, are you on it, really?
I'm interviewed on that. Yes, indeed. Not for very long. I think everybody got about a minute or two each. So what happened there, Derek, was when I was in college, my father was still working on the lighthouses, and he was in the Hook Lighthouse in Feather-on-Sea in Wexford there, and he was the principal keeper down there with another man. There was two people stationed opposite each other. But I got a call because the Commission of Irish Lights, for some reason, guys used to go sick in the summertime more than in the winter.
Okay.
And you put your name down as a student if you were the son of a principal keeper. So only the sons of a principal keeper could really, or the lighthouse keepers could actually register to do temporary lighthouse keeper. And it was only male. I'm sorry to say that there weren't any females, because they weren't set up for that in the 80s and 90s before they went automatic. But once you put your name down, you could get a phone call, and in the summer when you were finished college, so say first year college or second year college, I put my name down, and they'd ring you, and within 24 hours you'd be flown by helicopter out to a lighthouse for 2 weeks. So you had to be ready to do that in the summer. But believe it or not, jobs were very scarce in Ireland in the 80s, early 80s. You'd hardly get any job in Ireland. So getting this was really good for me. And I think a lot of my friends were actually quite jealous because you'd fly out and you might be there 2 runs, that's 4 weeks, and you wouldn't spend 10 cents in your pocket. So the money was okay. And man, was it good to fly out. I think the first one in college I went out to was the Kish Lighthouse in Dublin Bay. And good story, this actually. First time, you're 18, you're on your own, 17 years of age, 18 years of age. I was 18. And you're on the helicopter, it takes off, and it's quite foggy. It's a little foggy, and you kind of know this is not a good thing for a helicopter. And you're sitting up with the pilot. It's a small, I think it was a Belco. It's a 4 or 5 seater helicopter. And the pilot's Norwegian, and he's flying out. I won't say his name because he was a lovely guy. And we're quite low. And I said to him, how do you know when you get to the Kish? Because it's 9 miles out, about 12 kilometers, 13 kilometers. And he said, oh, you'll know. And I went, do not use the radar here in front. Ah, no, he said. And next thing, the fog just separated. And he just absolutely banked up the side of the Kish Lighthouse and landed. And I was terrified, obviously, first time in a helicopter. And I remember the guys, there's 3 people on the lighthouse at any time. So 2 guys will be there to meet you and then 1 leaving. So there's a relief every 2 weeks and you change out of 1 guy or 2 guys. And so they just ushered me down from the top of the lighthouse, because the Kish is quite a dangerous, you have to go under the top through the net and into the tower. So that was my first flight out to and I stayed there for 2 weeks, and it was absolutely gorgeous. You know, if you have that mentality to be isolated and work away with yourself, it's a beautiful thing to have got a job in. But it wouldn't be for many, Derek. I wouldn't think a lot of people would cope well for isolation for a month on and a month off. So 6 months of the year you would have been out there on a rock or a lighthouse, and then 6 months at home probably wouldn't suit a lot of people. And I think it attracted people who would be able for that, or you wouldn't survive it. But it was great for a summer job. Wonderful. And although my friends did ring me once from the Lincoln Inn near Trinity on a Friday when I was on the Kish, and drank beer down the phone at me. So I won't give the names of those people, but they know who they are.
Yeah, exactly. There's always some that'll do it, you know. But kind of going on that then, right? So you mentioned about there's certain people that wouldn't be able to do it, that wouldn't maybe wouldn't be prepared mentally for it. When did you first become aware of mental health?
I guess when I was in school and going into university, you would have periods of blue, let's just call it that, and in a general sense. And I think a lot of young people, particularly males, and I know it's very common in females too, of the age of 18 to 24, would definitely go through periods of low and high. And I think that's the first time you mightn't even recognize it then as probably a type of depression, but that's definitely the first time you feel that you can't always be in a state of happiness. And I think people figure that out early enough on, certainly in the teenage years or early 20s, when I think it's quite common. And I'm pretty sure it's still as common as it was then, even though I think younger people, it's a better Ireland we're in now than it was in the 80s. But having said that, depression, whether it's a mild form or many different types of depression, I still think there's a huge amount of it around in the younger kids who go to college particularly, and we have to be careful about that. So that's when I recognize a little bit of depression and feeling low and high at times then.
We were just chatting beforehand, we were talking about kind of the setup of in colleges and universities for people who are experiencing mental health difficulties. Like, do you know what the setup is like over there in UCD?
Oh, I mean, I'm biased, I guess, and I think they have an excellent system in UCD. I mean, it's so much better than it was back when I was at college. In the 80s, I don't think there was any reference to anywhere you could go. I mean, they have obviously the health service there with the GPs, the counsellors, the psychiatrists. They're all there. There is a lot of pressure on the system for them. We also have a fantastic access and access lifelong learning centre in UCD, which I think is actually second to none in the country, where students with any sort of disabilities coming in can really use that office. And there's a terrific crew down there who really do a fantastic job. And then the Students' Union has a huge input to play in UCD, and they're well on top of this at the moment. And there's huge campaigns going on at the moment. And it's not just mental health awareness, there's sexual harassment awareness going on at the moment. And that's really big at the moment, and really trying to stamp out a lot of that as well, which often is the root cause of mental health illness down the road. So I think UCD is leading in the universities in Ireland, in particularly at the Students' Union and at the Access Office and at the Health Service. I think the programs are really working, but we still have issues. And because of the population size we have here in UCD, you're always going to get people who fall between, you know, the cracks, and we really would love to identify everybody. But it's also up to the students themselves to talk to each other and to bring people to people and, you know, interact. And I think that works quite well. It's a collegiate college, and there's a huge amount of increase in students on campus now. For example, there's a new global village come up at the far end of the college, where there's a new food hall and a new Students' Union representation there. And there's, you know, there is another bar, which might not necessarily be a good thing, but I don't think we can stop that. And I do think it gives an outlet for students, and they need that. So I think there's a 4 or 5 or 6 different ways of tackling mental health issues with the students. And I think UCD is really approaching them all. And I really do like what the Students' Union are doing at the moment, as well as the college. But resources are going to be the issue you hear about for everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but it's great that the students are leading the way, because, you know, it's kind of has to start from there. I think, you know, it's particularly talking to each other. We that comes up so much in the podcast that we talk about it. So, so when we mentioned ahead of teaching of learning, you said there was 5 subjects, or would it be subjects? That be
we call them subjects. You could get a degree when you come into science. You can get a degree in over 20 different subjects. So you can get a degree in physics and astronomy, a degree in financial mathematics, right down to the 5 that we look after in our school. So our school looks after some of the popular ones. You've probably heard of pharmacology. So that's really looking at drugs effects in the body. It would be a major part of someone doing a pharmacy degree. They would have to do quite a lot of pharmacology. So that's a popular degree in our school. And then we have neuroscience as a degree, where you're looking at the brain. Biggest issue coming down the track with mental health, obviously, is also neurodegenerative diseases and the care of people who are going to have Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, other types of degenerative diseases in the future. Biggest issue for probably the next generation is going to be the cost of that care. Then we have microbiology, and that's very important with COVID, obviously looking at viruses, bacteria, and other microorganisms and their effects. We have biochemistry, molecular biology. It's basically looking more inside the cells of the body and all the things, the proteins, all of the reactions that are occurring in the body. And it's really important for certain parts of life. If you're working in a laboratory in a hospital, you'd really want to be able to know your biochemistry, and there's many degrees that goes to. And then finally, there's genetics. And genetics, of course, is hugely important now, and it's made some tremendous advances in the last 20 years of what we can do. And that degree is from this school as well, and it's shared with the other biology school here, the School of Biology and Environmental Science. So we have 2 biology schools, Derek. School of Biology and Environmental Science, which will cover zoology, plant biology, and molecular biology, and then our school, which is more the biomedical subjects for, you know, like I said, neuroscience, pharmacology, genetics, micro. So they'd be more to do with humans and cancer research and all of the things that we're doing, really high level work. Cancer is a huge area of our school as well, and they're making, as you know, major advances in cancer in the last 10-20 years. Delighted to say, although it's still an absolute horror story in a lot of people's lives, unfortunately, as well. So lots of things going on, from
Yeah.
neurodegeneration to cancer to, to COVID. It all happens in the school here. So we've a very vibrant undergraduate program. And then we have a postgraduate master's programs where we do biotechnology,
Right.
biotherapeutics, business. So we've a really good program going on with these, about 4 or 5 master's programs, and they're very popular as well. So the school's doing well, and some great staff, and the students are back at last.
Yeah.
We dreaded and hated the Zoom
I
lectures,
imagine.
and really we saw mental health become as big an issue as it ever was, I think, during COVID. I think, Derek.
Yeah. Like, it changed, a lot of people's lives and the way people look at things in general, and interestingly enough, it's one of those, what for me, talking personally, it's opened me up to a lot of things, because I've started to kind of try and figure out some stuff and wanted to learn more things, and that's how the podcast, I guess, came about. And neuroscience is one that you mentioned that wasn't around, a number of years ago, and is now, but it's probably one of the more exciting sciences, because of the advances and the way that people are learning, and the research that's going into it. I would imagine for you, like over the last number of years that you've been doing it, it's a pretty exciting a place to be.
Absolutely. I mean, gosh, the technology is really pushing it at the moment. But, I suppose if I was to think of one area of biomedical science, I would say neuroscience is probably the most dense that we have to get to understand. I mean, there are so many of these cells in your brain talking to each other at any split second, and we really can't get a handle on that yet. We can get a handle on a few of them at a time and how they're working, but we can't get a handle on how they all work at the same time. And I think the people who look at more of the behavioral aspect are making advances as well with technology. But that's where we have to get to. I mean, we know a lot about individual cells in the brain and what they're doing, but what's happening. So, I mean, even for example, neurodegeneration, take Alzheimer's, they just haven't been that successful with the clinical trials that they're doing. There have been a few successes. There was one recently, they're looking at the proteins that are laid down, the amyloid. But it's troubling that we're not making as fast an advance in that as we are in other areas. But absolutely, the brain is such a difficult area. It really is. I mean, there isn't the computer capacity. They're trying to simulate parts of brain now and use computers to really just become a brain, and they're getting there. But we don't have the processing power at all. It's such a fantastic organ. It's like 10 to the power of, I think it's 100 billion neurons in the brain, and each one has maybe 4, 5, 6, 7,000 connections with another one. And if you think of the numbers involved, it's mind-blowing, really.
Yeah, it is. John, hang on for 1 second. I'll read out this advert and we'll get back to it. Is that okay?
Yep.
Thank you, John. Okay. Fusion Training Centre, Monksland, Athlone. A place to train in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, kickboxing, martial arts and CrossFit. A great atmosphere with experienced coaches and a real sense of community. If you want to join the team, find us on Facebook at Fusion Training Centre or drop in for a chat. Fusion Training Centre, train like a warrior. I should know that off by heart now, 141 episodes in, but we're still struggling with that. And we could talk about neuroscience and that maybe. But there's something I kind of wanted to chat to you about, and it's kind of, I suppose, pharmacology is a big thing as well. When I think of my own experiences with medication, and how I've had to take medication for bipolar and for anxiety. And I was reading a book. Well, I am reading a book at the moment. By Lawrence Slater. I can't think of the name of it, but it's called The Drugs That Change Our Mind. And I was reading about lithium. This is just an example of one, and how talking about these tests that they had to put people through and trying to figure things out and stuff. And this is just one drug. I'm talking about, because obviously I take it and it helps me and stuff like that. Do you find that when even if it's just in life in general, we all have these conversations, and I've had a little bit of a pushback on people saying that they wouldn't take medication, it's bad for you, and everybody's going to have that opinion. And you wrote about serotonin, which is one of the things that people will say there's a chemical imbalance in the brain, and the serotonin is the thing that we need to have a good level of, and people will dismiss that as well, which is another kind of interesting thing. What's your thoughts on that kind of idea of people being just a little bit maybe dismissive of these medications.
Yeah, very happy to just talk about that. I mean, first of all, you have to look at the science, the evidence. You know, I think you'll probably hear that from anybody on this program who's a scientist, that they really go by what the evidence is, and I'm no different. I really like to read an original article if it's talking about serotonin or dopamine or any of the other drugs, and I'll make my own mind up as well as listening to what other people say. Too many people are too quick to go in with an opinion when really they don't have the evidence, and they haven't read it, and you know, they're not aware of all of the topics. So that's the first thing I would say. So when it comes to something like serotonin, I mean, I did my PhD on antidepressants, would you believe? You probably didn't know.
No.
But I've forgotten nearly at this stage, but I worked on a very specific compound called buspirone, buspirone, which was a serotonin agonist. In other words, it worked on the receptors. And I spent 3 years or more working on it. So I'd like to think I know a little bit about it. The biggest question we always had, Derek, about antidepressants, including this one, was why did they take 2 weeks to kick in for most people? Why can't you give a bigger amount, 10 times the amount, and they kick in the same day? So that was a huge area. And really, we think it's to do with these receptors on the cells in your brain changing in numbers, going up and down in numbers, and the drug pushing that. And then it being more responsive if the receptors are larger, more of them, and there's a lot of theories about that. So even my 3 years only made a small step in our knowledge, but I would support taking drugs if they help the person, and if they've been shown to be safe. And, you know, there is absolutely no reason at all why a person, say, even if 60% of people got benefit from, say, SSRI, you know, uptake inhibitors or tricyclics, I don't know if you know some of these, and say 40% don't, it's still worth it for that 60%, isn't it? So what's the harm? What is the harm of feeling better? You know, than saying, oh, I don't know, I don't like drugs, and I'm not sure this does anything for 30% of the population, but it does for the other, you know, 60, 70%. So I would be very, very pro using drugs that help people in their lives have a better quality of life. And let's face it, people go around with many types of mental health illnesses for very long periods without getting any, you know, without getting any resolve. And really, there probably is help there for a lot of the people at the chemical end and the pharmacology end. And I think we should use it. Yeah.
I like it's funny you talk about you know, people don't have the evidence. They don't, you know, necessarily know what they're talking about, but they will tell you anyway. And I'm the one who's taken it and feeling the benefits from it. And it's always interesting, like it's the Dunning-Kruger effect of which is rampant at the moment. But the idea, like, you know, that isn't interesting that you bring up that thing about the 2 weeks, because I think people, when they read a label, you know, in a box of antidepressants, will say, and they read in, they'll say, it might take 2 to 4 weeks to kick in, or whatever the wording is, but, you know, may increase suicidal ideation and stuff. And that will, you know, and understandably scare people a little bit and maybe put them off taking it. And I did have a particularly rough time, but I was going through a particularly rough time anyway, you know, so I'm not sure how big of an increase it was and how I was, you know, the bad thoughts I was thinking about. And it's interesting that we still haven't really found that gap yet. And you say about the receptors and stuff, but it's I think it's always the way to go when we don't, like, as a layman to this kind of thing, when we don't know what we're talking about. If a doctor tells us this could help you, you know, this could get you through, you know, this dark period, and you might have to take them for forever. You may have to take them for a period of time. To be honest, if I feel all right, I'll take them forever if it needs be, you know.
Yeah. No, I mean, exactly. I mean, it's all about quality of life. I mean, if a person's having feelings where, you know, that they want to take their life or something, they should be taking drugs if it helps. And you know, I mean, to come back to that worst case scenario, you asked me earlier about my first sort of feelings about mental health issues. And one of the things that was brought to my mind very heavily back when I was in college was, you know, a close relative, you know, committing suicide. And I think that's what really gets to people, that the
Yeah.
health service in this country sometimes isn't doing enough. And we can't blame the health service entirely, but we are under so much pressure that things go by and get lost. And in this case, this person just walked out of a particular hospital and walked into a river, and
Mhm.
it really affected me for a long time after, and that's why I was very interested in mental health issues, particularly even now. As a senior person in university, I would always be involved and help with that side of things in the college when I can. But I have to say, taking drugs has got to be the way if a person's in a particularly bad
Yeah.
situation. I mean, they can't live their life in society without it. So I would be very advanced on that. The problem with neuroscience, though, Derek, is these drugs do go to the whole brain, and they don't target specific regions. And I think maybe in the future, with therapies that we could target more, I think we'll get more success, because we do know a little bit about what functional areas of the brain and what they're doing. The pleasure center, we're very aware of where that is in the brain, and we know a little bit about the frontal cortex and temporal lobes, and targeting a little bit more specific areas might be one way. But as a neuroscientist, I'm not a clinician, so there are lots of problems with what I'm saying as well. But I do think that drug taking will continue, and I think it's helping so many people. And even in university, I reckon there wouldn't be, some of the students that we have here studying would not be able to do that without intervention, pharmacological intervention.
Yeah, absolutely. And the push that it gave me to do other things, to start living a different life, by training and doing things like that. So there's so much tied into it. I have this written down, John, and I don't remember writing it down, but it is my handwriting. What is synaptic physiology?
Well, actually, it's just when you have cells in the brain, and there are different types of cells, but the major cell in your brain is called a neuron. So these are the major cells in your brain, and there are supporting cells, and there's just as many of those, if not more. But the neuron is the one that speaks to each other. They electrically excite each other. So the neuron, when it wants to signal to another neuron, basically it has to send a signal down a cable, gets to the end, releases a chemical, and then that chemical causes another electrical signal in the next neuron. But that chemical in the little junction is called a synapse. So that's where the chemical occurs. It's released and then goes to the other neuron in this tiny little gap called a synapse. So synaptic physiology is the study of what's happening in that region. So not in the neuron itself on the one side or the neuron on the other side, but the gap between where they nearly touch each other. That's called a synapse. So that's called a synaptic physiology, is studying that. So when you give a drug to someone, it's not not necessarily affecting the main neuron or the other neuron, but it's maybe having its effect in the synapse between the two neurons. And that's really what synaptic physiology is all about. And the receptors are often located either on either side of that little synapse, and that's where the drugs tend to work primarily. There are exceptions, and there are other things. So I think of it as if electrically you're exciting a pole, and that pole has to hit another pole, but just between the poles is a small little gap, and that's where the action is. That's called a synapse, and that's where the chemicals are released, and they only last for a split second, and it's only nanometers wide, so it's practically touching each other, the two cells. But that's where the action is for these drugs, for these antidepressants and other types of drugs. And I think it's one of the areas they study mostly, but they also study the neurons as well, and how that electrical activity works, and we know a lot about that as well. But it's not as complicated as I'm making it sound, in the sense of why do we use electricity and then a chemical and then electricity again?
Yeah.
I think people need to realize that how the brain works is, I would simply put it this way. It's all about the firing of these electrical signals from neuron to neuron and coding. So in other words, if you think about a certain burst of activity in the brain, codes for one thing, your face, a color. Bursting of activity of another set of neurons may code for another thing, or a memory, or recalling something. So the whole of the brain works by coding of electrical signals, and that's how we are. And I think the chemical gap, billions of them exist. They're what make the electrical signals all fire and code appropriately.
See, I think I just like the sound of it, but it's it's great to hear it broken down. I know you said you're making it sound more complicated than you are, but I like it being broken down for me to kind of understand, because I know there's like, you mentioned Alzheimer's already, and I know you worked on a paper about Parkinson's and kind of the understanding of the illness. Um, is that another one that you would find that, that's moving along quite quickly, or is there some frustration still there?
There is some frustration, but there is a connection between a lot of these neurodegenerative diseases.
Right.
So you mightn't think that there's a connection between ALS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's, but in fact, it's all down to degeneration of nervous tissue. And
Right.
why does the nervous tissue suddenly start to deteriorate in a specific person at a specific age? So they're trying to get a handle on that at the moment. And I think they're making some progress about what proteins might be involved in the neuron that are starting to regulate this breakdown. And if they can block them, they might block the breakdown of the neuron. So there is research, but what is majorly happening is that they're noticing that there are some similarities between many of the different neurodegenerative diseases. So they're not isolated as much from each other. I think Parkinson's is a tough one because there's this very specific region of the brain which it starts in, whereas Alzheimer's, it's a little bit more diffuse. There are regions that it's more prominent in its beginning as well. And then there are other degenerative diseases which seem to cover the whole brain. So it's are the frontal lobes of the brain. So really, they need to know what's causing the neuron to suddenly start dying when it shouldn't be. And let's face it, people often talk about old age and people getting old, but you don't expect cells to die prematurely. So why would you expect the neurons to die prematurely? So they need to get a handle on what are the signals or the proteins in those neurons that are causing the cell to self-destruct in a way, which should survive longer. And they're making some progress. The problem with Parkinson's is you can only give drugs so long to a region that's dying, because when all the cells are gone, giving the drug won't affect them. So,
Of course, yeah,
if you have cells dying in a very small region of the brain, and 80% die before you see the symptoms of Parkinson's, by the way. So you have 20% of the cells left, and you're giving dopamine precursors, which become dopamine in the brain. They won't work as well over time because the cells are dying and dying and dying, and they're getting used to the dopamine and they're desensitizing to it. So in a way, that's not going to be the solution in the future. The solution has to be to stop the cells dying in the first place.
Yeah.
And the pharmacology is great, and it's really useful. And they also have stimulation experiments now where they can stimulate that region of the brain or regions nearby, and that's working well. But at the end of the day, I'd love to see the research moving on to stopping the cell death, the dying of the cells. And that, if we get that for Parkinson's, we'll be improved. Our chances of getting it for Alzheimer's or for ALS or other degenerative frontal lobe degeneration, that will be improved as well. So advancing one area will definitely advance the other areas as well.
There's that from someone looking in, it's the thought of like, why isn't cancer gone, or why isn't Alzheimer's gone, why is, and I guess for someone like me, I just don't understand the scope of the brain for a start, with the degenerative illnesses obviously, but with cancer as well. It's the scope of the disease in itself that we don't get. So we think this should be, you're going at this years, why haven't you got it solved? But it's so much more complicated.
Well, if you look at take a neuron, a cell, and you go into that cell and you say, how many proteins are in there? How many signaling pathways are in it? And it could be thousands. So, and you have so many different types of cells. So until we get a full rundown on every single signaling pathway in a cell, we probably won't get to the bottom of all of these diseases and illnesses. But we're getting there. We have an enormous amount of knowledge now that we're gaining on the signaling in cells. And the more we get at that, the more they develop a drug that can block just that one signal. And if you can do that for a particular signal that's causing something to be negative, you can block that without disturbing the rest of the body. It's all about specificity. In other words, not knocking out something good with the bad. And I think we've made massive, like take rheumatoid arthritis, they're making massive inroads because of the knowledge of the pathways that are involved in us breaking down our own cells and autoimmune disease. The brain, they're also making some progress, but not as quickly as the cancers and the arthritis. It's slower, and it's slower because the tools aren't as easy to use there as well. But we're getting there, and I have to say, if we go at the speed we're going at up to the last 10 years, for the next 10 or 20 years, I can see major progress being made in neurodegenerative diseases. And mental health as well, although mental health is quite a complicated area because there's so many different types. And it's, as I said to you before, it's because you've 100 billion neurons all connected to each other. If one person's connections are not the same as, and they're not, every single person in the world has different connections, it's going to be very difficult because it is about, I mean, they've made such great inroads now in dyslexia and autism, Asperger's, and the way we train the brain to rewire can be really important as well. And just because someone thinks differently by using different pathways in the brain doesn't make them any different from someone else in the sense that we're all equal. But we need to understand why someone uses one pathway to calculate something and another uses another. So we're getting there with that as well. A lot of work goes on that. I love the studies with using the functional magnetic resonance imaging, where they image your brain functioning in real time. They tell you to say something, to do something, and they can see the cells lighting up they're getting that down now to millimeter and less levels, so they can actually go in to groups of neurons and which ones are involved and how they're acting together. Really? So if they can look at people with illnesses, they hopefully will be able to see what's going wrong and maybe go after that. But that's just something I particularly enjoy about myself.
Yeah, the mental health one is I guess people don't know, again, the amount. If you go through the lists of what is listed as a mental illness, it's such a huge scope of different things. But like, it makes sense when you talk about the billions of going on up there, and it is like, how do you jump? That's the thing. Like you're talking about Parkinson's. How do you jump ahead of something? How do you cut it out before it happens? But maybe what you're talking about, like
but Derek, what's an average person? You have to start there, and there isn't such a thing. I mean, every single person on this planet, whatever billion are on it, is different, and they probably are using a different set of circuits in their brain. Where do you start? I mean, what do you say is not normal? That's where you have to start, and I think any good neurologist will tell you about that. And we want people to have been trained to live in society and be respectful and be a good human being. But that's what that's what we train everyone to do. But some people don't don't fit in that pattern. So is that abnormal? Is that bad of the brain to have them being excitable or hyper or I mean, it's probably not anything that the brain is doing wrong. It's just doing it differently in a way.
Course, yeah. Could I ask about, because like I said, I was doing a bit of research on you before I wrote the episode. Yeah, so I'm sorry, but it's nothing too. Well, it is personal, of course. But the list of what you have written about, written papers on, and look, a lot of the stuff I didn't even understand half of the words that you're using. But how do you go like from serotonin, I think it was 1990, and then through things like Parkinson's? How does your studies move through that?
Well, that's a good question, because it happens a lot of scientists as they start off their career. First thing you do is you pick a PhD that you want to do. So, I mean, I picked one that was working with antidepressants. I was interested in neuroscience. And then you might say, well, why do you move to something slightly different? And that's a good question. And often it's a simple answer. You are looking for a job and you're going to your next job, and you see a few, and you don't always have exactly the same thing being offered somewhere else that you can, like, so going from a PhD to what we call a postdoc, you look around for what you're interested in continuing. You may have got fed up of what you were studying, and you may say, I'd like to study something else. And a postdoc is a good start for your career. If you want to go on, for example, to university, you will have to do a few postdocs in science. So I looked to the UK, and I saw that they were working on dopamine and serotonin. They were working on serotonin as well. And but it was being done with a different technique. And I said, I'd like to have a go at that, learn a new technique, but they are using some of the information I was, but they're also using another neurotransmitter. So I started out with dopamine then, and that brought in the Parkinson's angle. So at the end of that 3-year position, 2.5, I looked back to Ireland and I said, well, you know, I've learned that technique. I know about those neurotransmitters. Do I try to continue and become a world expert on just this technique and that transmitter? And I thought, no, I'd like to come back to Ireland, and I'd like to now learn this other technique, which was for recording from single cells in the brain. So you put a glass electrode down on a single neuron, and you can record the electrical signal on that single neuron as ion channels open and close. And you can actually record one ion channel on the membrane opening in response to a drug or whatever. So I came back and learned that technique along with some of the neurotransmitters I was interested in, and that got me into the Alzheimer's end, because we were able to measure what was going on in the neuron in certain models in animals. So I guess it depends on where you want to go, what technique you want to learn, and do you want to stay in exactly the same area? Now, I will say one thing, Derek, and this is very interesting. Most people who stay in one drug, one protein they work on for all of their life, they will become world experts on that, and they'll do very well. People who change around a little bit tend to be more superficial, and they don't do as well. But there are exceptions to that. So I think if you stay on one protein all your life as a scientist, you've probably a better chance of being recognized internationally as the person who is that expert.
Yeah.
So it is. I think a lot of people do that, and they seek out that. But it's all about where the jobs are, and postdocing is very short term. You only really get 1 to 3 years in any position, and you might get through 2 or 3 or 4 before you might like to look for something else, or stay in research in maybe an institute that you get more longer term employment. So I guess it's about jobs as well as your interest.
Yeah.
But people do seek out what they want, and many do change their area over a 3 or 4 year period, and they will change techniques, and technology changes as well. So I think I was always driven by the technology as well, which was lovely. It's a subject called electrophysiology, and that's really recording electrical signals in the neurons in the brain.
Okay, and with all that, like, was there any particular studies or papers that you don't remember fondly, I guess, like with frustrations, or halfway through you're like, I could do it, getting rid of all this?
Absolutely. I mean, come on. I mean, all scientists look at their work and go, well, what does it really mean?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, there are people out there who've made very big steps, very big differences. I mean, ours are all small steps, but there are people who've really discovered a protein that they're now using as a drug in the clinic for patients, and those scientists must feel very, big about that, and very, excited about it. I think one thing that worries us in science is publications. It's become the must, and it's forcing people to publish. And is the data really as good as it should be?
Okay.
And this is a bit of a worry going forward. And I think, it's going to become a bigger issue as people's jobs and promotions are based on how much you publish and how much you do. Are they going to push out stuff too quickly? Are they going to publish? Have they done enough work on it? And I think it's a little bit of a worry, and there's definitely evidence out there that this has been a problem in some laboratories. So, I think that's one worry in science.
Yeah.
But the good people who are producing such wonderful things makes up for any small amount of that's out there.
Absolutely. And do you think there's like a lot of, because I like to read. I'm a big reader. Do you think there's a lot of literature and maybe accessible, I guess, to the subjects that we're talking about, because we don't want to go in and jump in at a textbook level when we want to learn about a subject. We kind of go a bit easier,
I think one of the things that scientists really do badly on is communicating with the public.
Okay.
Their work. And I know that Science Foundation Ireland, the big grant agency in Ireland, they make us all write our abstracts in layman's term. Okay, so that's the starting point. And scientists have to be trained how to write in layman's terms, and that's what we do to PhD students. We try to train them that there's 2 points to the abstract: make it scientific, but also make it lay as well. So write 2 abstracts, one for the lay person and one for your peers. But I do think there's more books being published. and there's more authors writing for people that are not pure scientists.
Yeah.
And that is definitely happening more. Look, one of my friends, Luke O'Neill, he publishes regularly for children, adults in his area. So, there are great examples of other scientists doing that as well. And it's fantastic to see it. We should be doing more. I write reviews regularly as well, but they're really for a scientific population. And, in a way, it's quite a learned skill if I had to rewrite that review for you,
Yeah.
and I'd struggle probably. So it is, I think not enough of us are trained to write, fact books, but in a really, a readable way. And it is a regret that a lot of scientists are poor at that. But we are being forced, and I think it's good to do a lot more. And certainly there are some good ones out there. So you should be able to find books now on most topics that you want to read about. There are some fantastic ones out there. So I would say it's got a lot better. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I think I in particular, I've come across pharmacology and neuroscience. It kind of seems to be a lot of people becoming more and more interested in it. And I guess that's the way that the previous authors are writing it, and as it goes along, it's only going to get better and more accessible for people anyway. And that's
absolutely,
it can only do good.
Absolutely, it's going to get better.
Yeah,
it always has. It always has, Derek.
So, like when I was growing up, UCD is such a prestigious place for people to study. What do you like? Obviously, we've talked about your department. But what do you think it is that makes UCD such a unique university?
Well, I mean, don't forget, I graduated in Trinity now as well.
Yeah,
Dave.
that's good point.
So I know both, and I have to be careful what I say between the two, because there's a bit of rivalry there. I would think. Although UCD offered me my first job, as a lecturer, so
yeah.
What the things that I like about UCD is the campus, and I think let's start there before we talk about the academics and the actual courses. The campus is beautiful. They've landscaped UCD. I don't know if you've been in. I know the front isn't looking as well at the moment, but it will be. But the landscape around UCD, there's a walkway all around the perimeter now. There's forests. There's nature. And if a student or a staff are feeling a bit, down in their office at lunchtime or studies, go for a walk. There's 2 huge lakes in UCD. There's some fine buildings, and it's a nice campus aesthetic. Therefore, it relaxes you a little bit. That's the first thing I would say. I think the staff in general are very good. I think they respond to students and they'll speak to students. I think that's important. I think the standard of lecturing in general is very good. But I also think, as I mentioned earlier, we have the top access department in Ireland in our university. The ALL, Access for Lifelong Learning, they really, and the Disability Centre in there, are probably the best in Ireland. And I'm not saying that as a bias, because I know the other universities well, but it really, really, really has led all of the conferences and the push in Ireland have come from UCD, and they really have a good disability awareness service as well for students who come in. And I do think that makes a huge difference. I mean, something like 1 in 10 students have issues, probably 2 in 10 realistically, 20% of any class you're in, there's issues. And I think universities have to be absolutely aware of this and have to be putting that kind of resource, 20% of the resources into that. It's important. And I think moving forward, we may even be more than 20% of the population that there's mental health issues, other issues. There's dyslexia would be very common in the university, and it has to be addressed as one of the, the long term, but there's so many more issues that are arising. And really, they're the 3 main reasons, I suppose, that I like the university. Good staff, good campus, good facility, good understanding of what should be done. Not always the resources are there, Derek, for all of this,
of course,
but they try, and we absolutely try.
It's great. It follows on from the conversation from last week. I talked to John, who's obviously in a college over in the States, but he's from Britain himself, but he talked a little bit about growing up watching Woody Allen films, and everybody was going to see a psychiatrist and everybody was seeing an analyst and stuff. And the Americans seem to be more open to it. But in particular in the college, he said that a lot of students are dealing with issues, and they will go to the professor before class or lecture and let them know they have a note, they're feeling particularly anxious today and stuff, and they will be given that kind of leeway. And I was hoping, and it's heartening to hear from you, like that it was similar in Ireland.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, we can do better, but
Yeah.
the majority of staff are very well aware of what they should be doing, and they do. We have a system where we will always be aware of who has needs in the class, and we're supposed to deal with that and feedback. But we also have a buddy system in UCD where we try to get students to talk to students,
Yeah.
and you know, sometimes they want to talk to their own age group more freely than they would to an older academic, and I think that works as well. And I think you've got to have that working as well in a university, that there's good buddy partnerships between students that they can bring their problems to, and then they're the knowledgeable ones will tell them what to do next or where to go.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because you don't get them coming to the lectures as much as they probably should. Some lectures wouldn't be as accessible as others, there's no doubt about that, Derek.
Yeah.
But I would hope that most lectures would be somewhat accessible to the students to help them. Certainly I have a very open door policy, and it seems to work. But yeah, we can always do better.
Yep.
But we're certainly in a better place than we were when I was in college, Derek.
Yeah.
You know, it may be that we just had an amount of mental health illnesses as much then, but we're certainly, I think, more aware of it now. Yep. And trying to be more proactive. But it's huge. And 30,000 students I see walking across the campus there in the last few weeks. It's like a little village, a little town, and we need to resource it. We need to
absolutely. So I don't know if the academic part of your brain ever switches off, but if it does, what do you like to do in your spare time?
Well, I'm actually used to be squash, but I'm now tennis, because I had some injury to my knee. And I think anybody who's played racket sports or sports for 10 or 20 or 30 years, the joints give in a little bit, Derek, as you get older. And I'm going to tell you that now. So I play a bit more tennis. So I'm the captain of the local tennis team.
Nice.
So not great at tennis, but I like to play and watch, and I do a lot of that. Certainly, I'm always been a competitive sports person, football and that. I preferred it than swimming or, you know, on your own type sports. I always like to try and beat people at things. But a bit of walking as well. I think as you get older, you kind of get to do that a bit more, because it's probably the better way to treat your body, hill walking and stuff like that. And generally speaking, I'm not doing as good a job during COVID with the diet intake and the exercise, because I think everybody suffered a bit, and we're all trying to get back to where we were weight-wise, I think, more than anything. So I think, you know, I have to act on that a bit more. But generally speaking, I put a lot of my time at the moment into the club, the tennis club at the moment, and I'm terrible at golf. I'll play a few times a year as well, and I'll put my hand to a few things like that. So I do like sport a lot, and I have played a lot of sport in my time. But I'm slowing down, I have to say, and I think we all do. You know,
we do. What would you say? Obviously, you mentioned, you talk about tennis. Roger Federer being, you know, probably the greatest of all time. Pretty a sad. You know, a couple of weeks ago, obviously, he had to retire. Obviously, anybody who's ever watched a game of tennis, a regular game and a Roger Federer game, there's a slight difference. A sad to see him go, but obviously it was the right time for him.
Well, it's not like he's giving up tennis completely. You have to appreciate that he's giving up tennis at that level. I mean, so that level he's at, it only takes a tiny wear in a joint, tiny tear in an elbow tendon, and you're out. You know, you may never recover enough to get back at that level. So he's had to decide that he's withdrawing from that level of tennis because of the injuries to, you know, his joints. And people of his level will generally have issues as they get older. I mean, Boris Becker, I think, had both his knees and elbows replaced, you know. You know, it's huge effect on these professional sports people. They wear out quickly. You can see what's happening in rugby at the moment. But I think Roger will adapt, and he'll play, and he'll do the senior tour, and he'll coach probably. So he's going to live a life in tennis. You know, it's just he will be sad about the competitiveness that he's been used to, and I think that he'll eventually get used to that over time with being busy doing other parts. Of course. But I think anybody who plays high level sport of any type is going to wear out physically. eventually, anybody. And I'm so much of an admirer of our two Cork the chaps with the rowing. They are absolute giants. And I do hope that particular, they're able to keep going for a bit longer as well. So boxing is something I have other views on, I'm afraid, Derek does. So
is that actually, can I just follow up on that? Because that's an interesting point, because it's becoming more and more a talking point of injuries, brain injuries.
It's the evidence is there.
Yeah.
I can't you can't argue. I mean, particularly heavyweight boxing, if you look at the evidence, look, if you think about it, every time you smash a hand into your head, like the brain is pushed from one end of the skull to the other and back again, ripping and tearing apart neurons. I don't need to say any more, do I? I mean, talk to any neurologist in a hospital and they'll tell you about how much damage is done every time. I mean, I see 3 rugby players in Ireland now have a court case, so, you know, I won't comment on that. But, you know, they're going to have to change the way that sport is played quite dramatically in the next few years. Dramatically. Because it's coming, otherwise they're going to shut it down. They won't have a penny.
And American football is another one led the way with this kind of discussion. The
problem with American football is they wear a lot of gear to protect it themselves, but it doesn't really protect. So sometimes not having protection makes you more aware to be careful. So you know, in some ways it goes against wearing lots of protection when you're still doing the damage. But American football's always had cases, and it will continue to have. So, but they'll have to stop the impacts. You know, but sport is so good for you if it's done in moderation and it keeps you fit. It's probably the most important thing you can do for your health is to be involved in sport. But obviously, at the extreme level, you are obviously going to run out. Normally, it's your joints that will go first, and you know, you'll know when you get a bit older, Derek, what I've just said there.
Oh no, I know already, John. Don't worry about that. I do a bit of CrossFit and a bit of jiu-jitsu and stuff, and I'm starting to like feel it in my hips a bit. But I enjoy it, and look, it's not high impact stuff, which is for me more important. John, you've been an absolute pleasure to chat with. I like the fact that I didn't have to do too much heavy lifting, and you were you were also, John, very kind to just pass by some of my questions, which were, you know, well, I was hanging in there for a lot of it, but you were very, very patient with me.
No problem at all. Look, it's been a pleasure. And, you know, Derek, mental health issues are really, really top of my mind, particularly working in a university with 18 to 25 to 30-year-olds. And it's and being a neuroscientist as well makes me feel a bit sad that we're not a bit further on with being able to help everybody. And I see a lot of, you know, very sad cases and so on. But, you know, we have future, it's bright. And I do think it's getting better. And I think that a lot of students are being helped and are doing well. So it's sad in one ways, it's positive in another. Let's be positive and hope for the future that things really crack on in the next 10, 20 years. Because I think we are looking at that kind of scale here.
And like, you know, people keep talking, keep sharing and stuff like that. John, can you hang on for 1 minute? I'll finish this out. I'll get a quick photo for the archives and we'll be on our way. All right. I want to also thank John Francis for his contribution to the tech side of things. I want to thank the people I always thank, my mum, my dad, my granddad, Jerry Calvin. We're on YouTube. Subscribe to that if you would. It helps. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all the usual. If your podcast, you know, the platforms are Apple, Spotify, Anchor, Google Podcasts. And obviously, thank you to everybody who tuned in today. And once again, John, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Derek. Really appreciated you having me here today.
Thank you. All right, everyone. See you next week. Take care. Bye.